I thought that I would learn almost like a formula in a sense of here's how you successfully build an open source company, but it actually has turned out to be very different than that. There's so many different flavors of open source companies. It's kind of a fragile way to build a company, and you have to be really kind of thoughtful of how you're working with your community, because once you put something out in open source, it's free. Kind of one of the unspoken rules is that it's going to stay there and it's going to stay free.
Yeah. Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools. I'm joined today by Robby, who is, firstly, I'm a big fan of Robby's podcast, Open Source Startup Podcast. And Robby has been an investor in DevTools infrastructure for 8 years.
Yeah, long time.
Yeah. So thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me on. And huge shout out to my co-host of the Open Source Startup Podcast, Chen, who I admire so much. And I probably would never have lasted 3.5 years doing a podcast without him. So he's the best. Yeah.
Just my small Twitter interactions with Tim can attest that he seems like an absolute legend. So firstly, as I said, big fan of the show. And what I wanted to ask you is about what kind of things have you learned about DevTools and about growing DevTools from the show? Because you've done over 100 episodes now.
Yeah, we've done about 150 episodes now, which is pretty crazy because time has just kind of gone by as we've continued to do these. But I'll maybe go back to the beginning on why we started the podcast to begin with, because I think it informs a lot of how, at least I've thought about DevTools and how to grow a DevTool company, especially using open source. Tim and I started the podcast initially because him and I were spending a lot of time digging into go-to-market strategies for DevTool companies. And we wrote this blog post a number of years ago that interviewed the founders of HashiCorp, LaunchDarkly, Lightstep, about some of their early go-to-market thinking and strategies and how they got their first enterprise customer. And through the course of those interviews, we learned a ton, and then we consolidated all of our learnings into a blog post. And then we realized after that the actual conversations we had, like the recorded ones, were the most valuable part of that work. And we had wished that we had taken those recordings and posted them. And so that's what got us starting to think about a podcast. And then when we were looking at what was on the market, there were a few really awesome DevTool focused podcasts, but not a lot that were specific to open source and how to build an open source company, not just a project. So we kind of started it as a little beta project, and we didn't really know what we were doing. I was doing the editing myself early on. So if you listen to the earliest episodes, they're quite painful. But we've graduated to an awesome editor who's way more professional now, who works with us. And the funny thing is, at least for me, doing the podcast, I thought that I would learn almost like a formula in a sense of here's how you successfully build an open source company. And there kind of be like a set of pretty much typical steps and things that founders go through. But it actually has turned out to be very different than that. There's so many different flavors of open source companies and open source business models, and they change over time, and they change with the community that you're serving. And so I actually have, I've kind of changed my thinking, and now I have just felt like every situation is so different depending on what the user community wants, depending on what the opportunity set is. And the last thing I'll say, we were talking about this earlier, but one of the things that I have completely changed my tune on when we first started doing the podcast, in my mind, the most successful way that you would generally build an open source company is having a project's creators go out and start a company around it. And there's so many examples now of new open source standards that come out, like something like OpenTelemetry, where a number of other companies are created around it. And a number of those companies are not tied at all to the project's creation. They've just seen its rise, and it's more of a new standard that a lot of folks are using. So it's just one example of how there's just many different flavors of open source companies, and everything is very kind of specific to the situation, the point in time, and the user base.
Yeah, that's really good learning. And I know that when you were talking about that, one of the episodes that reminded me of is the Sentry episode with David Kramer, and how he was talking about how it was just a Django library initially, and that they were working on it for a long time before it became a company.
Yeah. It's So David was he stands out as one of my favorite episodes actually, because he is such a down to earth and honest person, despite kind of how successful and big the company's gotten. Because usually, we spoke about this earlier, when a company's young and founders are still figuring things out, they'll be very kind of open, honest, unfiltered about what's going on. And then as they get media training and get more senior, then it's very, very polished and they're amazing speakers, but you don't generally get as much authenticity in a way. And David was just super open and honest about everything that went on. But it's such a good example of the project was around for a long time. Like he did not try to turn that into a company for a number of years. And one of the things that we've seen over the last 5-6 years, but particularly in 2020 and 2021, when there was a lot of capital available, investors pushing project creators to create companies and giving them a ton of money really early, which then means those companies have to go and try and monetize in order to meet their valuations. And a lot of these projects just take so long to really resonate with the community. And so trying to force a business model too quickly and trying to, grow a community maybe in a way that's not super organic, it can really hurt the opportunity. So it's kind of a fragile way to build a company. And you have to be really kind of thoughtful of how you're working with your community when you try to focus on monetization and kind of how you're going to set that up. Because once you put something out in open source, it's free. It kind of, one of the unspoken rules is that it's going to stay there and it's going to stay free.
Yeah.
We've had a few episodes talking about situations that have gone wrong where something that was free and open source then went to paid. But it's kind of the open source model of building a company in a way can be at odds with venture timelines and scaling. So it's quite tricky. And I think David, but a number of other examples, didn't raise right out the gate and took some time to really nurture and grow their community before really identifying the company potential behind it.
Yeah. When you're talking to founders, if they want to build, I guess people must come to you and say I want to build an open source startup.
Yeah.
What kind of stuff do you say to them?
So it's really funny. I hear this a lot where founders will say, I want to use open source. And they kind of look at it, especially if they don't have a lot of experience with open source, they look at it as this tool that they can use, kind of like a go-to-market strategy. Yeah. They're like, oh yeah, it's freemium, but it's not at all the same.
Yeah.
An open source community is very different. It's essentially a standalone product. And oftentimes, depending on how it's constructed, it can be almost a competitor in a way to what you're building. So it's really, and there's also a community that may be helping you build out your project, that might be adding functionality, adding to your documentation, answering questions with one another, and where the community is hosted, whether a Slack or a Discord. So it's a very kind of sensitive thing that encompasses much more than a go-to-market strategy. And so when I talk to founders that want to use open source, my first question is why?
Yeah.
Why does this help you? And why is it right for this kind of tool and community? Because there are certain types of tools where whoever the user profile is, they want it to be open source because they want the transparency. That's where how other tools are being built. But then I also want to understand how they're planning on building a community alongside building a product and how much thought has gone into that, because it is a hard road to go down to build an open source company. And so doing it and not fully thinking through the cons, I think folks think through the pros a lot, where they're like, oh yeah, distribution, everyone will use it, everyone's going to contribute to it. But then the downside of needing to maintain this community and needing to contribute to it, needing to add functionality to it, while at the same time you're trying to make money, especially if you're raising venture capital early on, it's quite challenging. It's really hard.
Yeah. And so is it something that you think, do you work with founders that come at it with I think that we'll build a bigger business if we are open source? Or do you kind of focus on people that have already built this kind of open source project and they're now I want to build a company?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think I'm so formulaic about it to say that if someone wanted to open source part of their solution or thought there was huge benefits to that in the community, but they hadn't done it already, then I wouldn't fund them, because I'm also investing super early generally, pre-seed, seed. very early. I would say for the most part, the open source companies that I have invested in, they already have a project up and running usually when they're thinking about company potential, but it's not always the case. I have a number of companies that will build products on top of an open source standard, like an open telemetry, and or they might have an open periphery approach where they open source part of what they're building, but maybe not the core of it. So I'm comfortable investing in kind of all different flavors, but I want to understand the thought that's gone into it and the user research that's gone into it too. One thing that I spend a lot more time on than I think other folks that do really early stage investing is I care a lot about the pre-work that founders do, understanding their users and customers before they build or while they're building. So usually, even with open source, like before they've decided that part of their solution or the core of their solution should be open source, I want to know why and like what's informed that and who they've talked to, because even if they themselves are the user profile, they don't represent all developers or all data engineers or whoever their user profile is. So I want to know how much thought and work has gone into understanding why parts of their solution should be open source. And then if they have a pre-existing project, then a lot of that work has kind of naturally been done by virtue of that community existing. But that work up front is something that I spent a ton of time trying to understand with founders.
Have you given them advice about like where they should go and talk to these people? Because sometimes it can be quite tricky. I feel like if it doesn't exist yet, do you just go and kind of hang out in other open source projects or like related or like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a lot of times it'll be talking to folks who would be potential users, or if it's going to be like I talked to a number of founders who are going to be focused primarily initially on, say, like the Next.js community. So it's like, okay, how well do they know that community? And like how much time have they spent in it? How much do they know about what that kind of profile of engineer wants and like what kind of functionality, where their challenge is? Because even if they don't have something to necessarily show them yet, it's more about understanding, okay, what do they want me to build? Versus like kind of building something, coming out and saying like, okay, this is what I'm going to try and give to you. And the other thing that I've seen happen a number of times is folks will, if they don't kind of spend a good amount of time understanding what a community wants, and say they have an open source, either the core of their solution or part of their solution, they open source it, it just doesn't get adopted and they don't really understand why. And a lot of it is because it's not necessarily what that kind of group of users needs. Sometimes you can get lucky where you kind of release something and it like takes off. And that happens with a number of open source companies where there's a project that just kind of catches heat and they were like not necessarily expecting it. And then as they understand who's in that community and they understand the company building potential, then they really dig in. But yeah, I want to know kind of what kind of work and thought has been put into like understanding what the company potential is. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And I'm building something myself, and like I definitely, it was like, okay, this is a challenge I've got, put it out there and then just see. But it's like the rationale of like why open source and stuff is like, yeah, it's tricky, I guess.
Yeah. And actually, so this is the thing too, where I think it is a totally valid strategy to put different things out in open source and kind of see what hits. But the problem is once you raise venture funding, you're kind of sticking yourself onto a timeline of execution to be able to raise the next round, which generally the way that at least I think about it is every round that you raise, you want to be able to 3x that should be your target, to 3x your valuation by the next round. So what that means is whatever you're raising at, you have to achieve usually like metrics that will get you 3x your valuation by the next round. And so it's totally fine if you want to like put a bunch of stuff out there and like see what sticks, but that is kind of at odds with having this venture timeline of you need to perform in a certain way in order to kind of keep growing. So that's where it's really hard because I think some founders should do that more when they're kind of like in discovery, but they really shouldn't raise venture funding at that point.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So it's like you can do all the kind of like throwing stuff out there, but like before you look to raise money?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so is that like, maybe that transitions onto quite a quite a good topic of like, when should you look to raise money on an open source project?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, there are some projects that will take off, but they don't necessarily have company potential behind them. Like say and I've seen a number of projects like this where they're super widely used. Like I saw that there was an open source project that was really cool, really widely adopted. That was an open source version of QuickBooks, which is like super useful. A lot of engineers really liked it. They could kind of customize it more than QuickBooks. But then when you dug into who the users were, it was a lot of hobbyists, a lot of folks who are not going to pay necessarily for a solution. So when you really looked at that kind of like wild growth trajectory and you dug into who was in that community, you really don't see like company potential where like venture scale company potential in my mind is the ability to generate 100 million ARR in like 5 to 10 years. Like there's potential there. And so with a project that's taking off, but it doesn't necessarily fit in a category where there's enough budget tied to it, or the users aren't ones that will ever really be able to pay, then it's really challenging. Now, some projects will start with a lot of hobbyists as users and over time move up market, but then there really has to be a vision there.
Yeah.
And it's not just, oh, look at all this usage. Like I think, again, we saw this a lot in 2021, where project has like thousands of GitHub stars that like came up overnight, and everyone is excited about it and all these hobbyists are using it. And we're actually seeing this a lot in Gen AI right now because there's a number of projects that are being used for what I call like the experimental AI economy.
Yeah.
And they're taking off super quick and the usage numbers look amazing. Then when you dig into who's using them, it's a lot of hobbyists who are never really going to pay, or it's other AI startups that may or may not have the ability to pay, but then they're like getting funded at a rate that doesn't really match to the company potential there. So I think that's where it gets really messy, where like I think the growth in a project can kind of glaze like over what's really happening. There's some projects that aren't, super widely adopted, but the users in that community come from like really high quality companies with the potential to pay, and they're in a category that has a lot of budget allocated to it. And so like that might have a lot more to it than some others that are just super widely adopted, but none of those users will ever pay.
Yeah. So you mentioned there users who are from kind of like very legit companies, plus in a category that's like got budget.
Yeah.
So I guess there's like infrastructure and like these kind of like examples, I guess, databases, infrastructure.
Yeah. And it's not always like a replacement necessarily, but there's budget in the sense that companies it's automating some activity, or it's a better version of a tool where there could be budget allocated. So to give you an example, I have a portfolio company that I invested in from Cowboy called Mobile Dev. They have an open source project called Maestro. And it's eliminating a lot of manual work to do with mobile testing. Yeah. So there's budget in the sense that it's clearing up a bunch of time for these engineers, saving them time, so they'd be willing to pay for kind of like paid products on top that add automations. So, but it's real companies using it. It's like mid-market enterprise, like folks who have access to capital. It's not just hobbyists. And that's where things can get really, really tough for open source companies, is if they try to come up with a paid module. And then if you really dig into who's in the community, it's a bunch of folks who have no access to a real budget. The other thing I'll say on this, it's really hard to understand sometimes who's in your community. You can kind of go through in a more manual-ish fashion, like your Slack community or Discord, and kind of understand that way. But then now there's tools like Common Room, which are great for this, which will give you a sense of what companies are in there, who's really engaged, how are they engaged. So you can almost use that as more of a pipeline than you used to be able to for an open source project.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you can kind of see who's actually using it. And if you're like, if I was like mobile dev, like on day one, like pitching to you, like how are you thinking, can this achieve like 100 million ARR? Yeah.
So it's funny, they didn't start open source. When I invested in it, they weren't an open source company. But what was really compelling is the mobile testing space generally is really large. There's a lot of mobile test engineers, a lot of work that's very manual that would provide much better app experiences. If there was better test coverage, you could test more cases, you could make sure things wouldn't fail every time you did an update. And also it would just automate away a good amount of work that mobile engineers don't really want to do. The founder was at Uber and he was like a super elite mobile engineer there, knew the space really, really well, was kind of thought to be like a leader in understanding kind of like next generation testing trends. And so the market overall was quite big. They didn't start with an open source strategy though, which was interesting because at the time, it wasn't super clear that was necessary. And then over the course of, it was probably the first year where we really started to see, or audit, like to the founder, Leland, to his credit, really started to see the potential for there to be this new standard with Maestro around a testing framework for mobile. And that strategy ended up making a ton of sense. And it was, I think within the first year, for like one quarter of that year, it was the fastest growing open source project like period, but with real users, like users that, could eventually, and we're seeing this now, turn into customers of our paid products that sit on top of Maestro. But yeah, and by the way, I'd say that this is more common than not for super early stage founders where there's a slight shift in how they're bringing their product to market or what the product direction is, and that's totally fine. But when I invest, it's behind the fact that I think the founders have the right process of iterating with the community. They really have like those nodes and know what they want, and they have the ability to iterate and move depending on what the community is telling them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you like assess that? It's like you can just...
A lot of it is just spending time with the founders and understanding their process of like how they get user feedback, how they're like, even how coachable they are in conversations I'm having with them is a really good tell sign of how well they kind of like input output. And the thing is like all the folks that I back, all the founders I back are product visionaries, but they don't operate in a vacuum. They like take in feedback of like what kind of the community wants. So they have a direction, but they kind of shift go-to-market strategy. They shift their positioning. They shift parts of their product depending on what's going to work for the community. Another company that I was really lucky to work with that's done really well, not an open source company, but a security company called Drata. They automate security and compliance.
Is it like, it's like Vanta competitor?
It's a competitor, but biased opinion, much better. 100%. But one of the things, one of the things that was so compelling about that team was how much pre-work they'd done before they'd even like written a line of code. They had, I think when I first met with the team, there was like a Figma design of what they wanted to build that at different points during the meeting, I was like, oh, what happens when you click there? They're like, this is literally a design. There's like nothing in existence yet. But they'd done so much pre-work, especially since they were coming from an ed tech background. Like they'd gone through SOC 2 and compliance processes with their previous company, but they hadn't actually like built a security product before. And they'd done so much really sharp interviews, so many really sharp interviews with customers or potential customers to figure out exactly what they'd want in a solution. And it led them to some really interesting product insights around being continuous. So instead of a company automating their audit once a year, they would know at any point during the year if they were in or out of compliance. And also building in an auditor portal to make it even easier for their customers to automate and not have to email auditors separately from working with Drata. So there were so many points of insight that they translated like pain points with other products and pain points within their users to what they were going to build. And that's kind of like the really deep kind of customer centricity and like user informed process I like to see.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like it also is like the same methods that you kind of book these interviews and like meet people is like the same probably method that you'll use to actually like market it as well. And like, it's like if you kind of shows that you understand where these people hang out and like. That's actually a really good point. I haven't framed it like that before, but yeah, it does. It demonstrates your ability to get in front of those users as well. Because one of the things that's really challenging for especially first-time founders that are engineers, they really want to build because that's what they know how to do really well. And it's more
a regular than regular to find an engineer founder who really wants to work alongside their community and get that feedback and, like figure out how to get in front of the right folks and market to them. So I try to figure out if a founder kind of has that in them early on by seeing how they work, seeing their process. One of the biggest flags to me is when I meet founders at like the pre-seed or seed stage and they're like, no, this is just the right way to build it because I know it's right. And I like don't really need to get feedback, which there are some cases where that can work. But the problem is that's not really a sustainable strategy because if you operate in a vacuum, then suddenly like you're in your own echo chamber and you don't really know like what's kind of going on. So I think it's just really important to have like big ears when it comes to customer and user feedback.
Yeah, totally. That totally makes sense. So I had one last question, which is like, why you've like kind of like tied yourself to the mast of like open source. Like this is like so you've made a big like commitment that you believe in it. And so like, why do you think that open source is something to, I guess, why did you tie yourself to open source? Like what, you must believe that like, it's gonna be a source of like great businesses, like how? Yeah,
it's a good question. I don't think I was as like there wasn't as much thought put towards I'm going to tie myself to open source. It really just came out of curiosity and interest when Tim and I started the podcast, because I think both of us were like, Tim had a lot of experience as a founder and engineer building with open source. I'm a little bit more of like a self-taught builder, and open source is really where I've been able to learn a lot. And I love the community aspect of it. Like I'm a pretty community-centric person. So it more just started out of intrigue and curiosity. And also as I dug into it and met founders like Armand at HashiCorp, and really started to understand the power of building in a community-centric way, it just really resonated with, this makes sense when you're trying to build a new standard in particular, like something really big, to do it in this format where you are allowing the community to participate in it in a way that's just not, available if it's a closed source company or project or product. And so just the power of it, I thought was really, really interesting. And for a number of categories, I think that it is the right way to build the kind of like the biggest company, in the sense that there's like such a large potential to build a new standard in a way that you can't do if something's closed source. And I know there's a lot of debates going on about this right now, but I think with a lot of foundation models that are going to be, by definition, foundational technology, it's so important for them to be open source in a way, because it just creates so much more impact, and also the ability for others to participate more, trust what's kind of going into the models. Like it just creates kind of a different level of like trust and transparency and community involvement. So that's really where like I've gotten more and more infatuated with it over time. The more I've seen the power of it, but then also appreciated how hard it can be to build a company in an open source fashion. So become more kind of skeptical of founders that are a little bit too like, oh yeah, and then we're just going to open source this and it's going to make it successful. It's like, no, there's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah. That's really cool. And I think it's like, it's great to hear that kind of passion. And like, it's like kind of a beautiful thing really, where you think like humans are kind of like benevolently collaborating. It's like, I feel like it's one of the most, not to be too dramatic, but like one of the coolest things that humanity's ever done. It's just like collaborating on software where people that don't know each other across the world are just like helping build things that everyone uses. It's super cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think that the concept of building cool new technology and letting folks use it, fork it, like do with it what they want, and just being super open about like, here's what I've built. It's like just like it makes you very optimistic on technology and how it can bring people together, and how it doesn't need to be about making money and greed. It can really just be about sharing innovation. So there is something that is, not to get too like, whatever about it, but like soulful about it, where you don't get that with most software that's closed and very much just there for commercial ends. So I think that it's really powerful.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so thank you so much for coming, Robby. I know you're working on something very new. There's something coming down the pipeline.
It's new. It's stealth. She's building.
Robby is building. Maybe by the time it comes out, maybe there'll be announcements. I don't know. But definitely follow Robby on Twitter, and I'm sure that's where they'll hear first about what you're.
Oh yes, and listen to the Open Source Startup podcast.
Yes, definitely listen to. I recommend the Super Bass Paul Copplestone episode to get started.
Oh yes, that's a really good one.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to share before we?
No, this was fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much, Robby.
Thank you.